let's start. So I want to start off with so the future of tech-driven political warfare. There's three takeaways. And the first one is the ability of the Russian government and associated organizations to pair an attack on information systems with an attack on information content in a largely reproducible, cheap, and with little specific tooling is the future. So essentially, what the Russians did during the 2000 presidential campaign is what I would consider the future. There's also this idea that we're beginning to reflect offensive and defensive information security into explicitly social and political spaces, so Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, things like that. And then lastly, while we've created defenses for information systems, so think AV, IDS, filters, etc., we haven't really created a defense for social and political data, so things you would post on Facebook, Reddit, Twitter. With that, I'm Sina Kashefipour. I'm a threat analyst over at WebRoot. I've always been interested in sort of how we mesh technology with political influence and vice versa. This presentation are my views alone, not WebRoot's. Any questions, comments, concerns, just tweet me. That's where I'm most responsive. Okay. So political warfare isn't new. It is rooted in the US's contemporary tradition of national security. So coming out of World War II and into the Cold War, there's this line of thinking that says that nuclear weapons have essentially removed the need for war. And you won't engage in war because really that's just mutually assured destruction. And part of that, there's this offshoot of like other thinkers like George Kennan who said, well, you remove war, but you didn't get rid of conflict. There's still, people are going to still butt heads. They're still going to go at each other. It's just in a different way. And so he writes this memo in 1948, which is on organizing political warfare, which I take from for this presentation. So when we talk about political warfare, we're really talking about countries extending their political influence and their authority and going after that of their adversaries. So political influence in this case can be thought of as policymakers, how they make policy, how they relate to other policymakers, how society relates to policymakers, and then sort of the debates within society itself. Political warfare is really complex. So you're talking about overt and covert channels, you're talking about political alliances, you're talking about economic measures, and then the use of propaganda. So in this case, white propaganda, which is you're true, you're positional, people know the source, and then black propaganda is something that we would consider as misinformation, disinformation, and the source of that information is almost always obfuscated and it's always delivered maliciously. And then political warfare is this whole of government approach. So the government itself and its associated organizations are coming to bear onto a political problem. And then at the same time, war isn't a feasibility, it's not possible. You want to avoid war, rather you want to engage in a spectrum of conflict. So avoiding war, but engaging in complexity of conflict. So Kennan writes this in 1948, and the problem is that in the 1948 and in the 50s, 60s, etc., you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the social web, you didn't have the use of malcode, bots in our modern media environment. And what that means is the tactics and tooling have changed, but the strategy is not. And so when we talk about strategy, what we're talking about is you as an adversary are attacking what a defender trusts, his social networks, his financial networks, political institutions, and the consumption of and filter of social and political data. And then you're creating a message or narrative that is favorable to you as the attacker. And political warfare at its most specific is seeking to drive somebody towards a decision that is favorable to an attacker, or at its least specific and most chaotic is seeking to basically you find every division, you pour gasoline on it, and you light it on fire. You're looking for chaos, you're looking to weaken your adversary through absolute chaos and not a specific decision. So today's case studies are how the United States got Iran to the Iran deal and how the Russians interfered in the 2016 US presidential campaign. And they represent proofs of concept because they show, in my view, the realm of possibility when you begin to integrate technology into political warfare. But at the same time, they represent opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of complexity, execution, and speed of success. So let's talk about the Iran deal. So the Iran deal at its core is limiting Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. So before the deal, the Iranians are going out and expanding their program in such a way that they're either establishing breakout capacity, so the capacity to create a bomb very quickly, or to actually acquire a weapon. And so the deal sort of reflects this. It places limits on enrichment, stockpile, research and development, and then its facilities. And then also part of the deal is intense surveillance through the International Atomic Energy Agency. So every part of this program is categorized, is surveilled, and it's accounted for. So the Iran deal is a big political deal. The idea that you're going to get the Iranians to the table, to stay at the table, then ultimately consent to a deal is solely the product of Iranian decision-making and politics. And so the challenge for the United States is that war isn't feasible. This idea that you could physically eliminate Iran's program was not feasible, that the cost would pile up and the payoff would diminish. So the challenge was, how do you get Iran to an agreement or understanding without actually engaging in physical war? And how the United States does this is through Stuxnet, through sanctions, and then complex diplomacy. So Stuxnet is this very complex piece of malcode that is inserted into Iran's nuclear supply chain. So you're talking about from procurement and research down to deployment into the plants. So Stuxnet is very aggressive. It spreads via USB, it spreads via network, and it just keeps replicating until certain conditions are met. So when it meets this condition, which is a programmable logic controller, it drops a payload that modifies this PLC. PLC is modified, and it begins to tell the centrifuges to spin up, spin down, spin incorrectly, and in some cases, spin up so fast that the centrifuge would actually explode. While that's happening, false data is being fed into the Iranian program. So they assume, based on the data that they're seeing, that everything is okay, everything's working, but in reality, it's not. So Stuxnet is this explicit attack on trust. So it is the first of its kind to go after a supply chain like this in an aggressive, malicious manner. And so for the Iranians, they have to consider who's the initial vector. How does an adversary, how are they able to map out the program so well? And then is what the Iranians are seeing, is it true, is it real, is it actual genuine data? And then what is the willingness of an adversary to update and retarget? And so the narrative that Stuxnet creates for the Iranians is simple. You can't hide this program, and then every part of this program is going to be exploited, it's going to be destroyed. You have to get rid of this program, is what Stuxnet sort of communicates. So the problem with Stuxnet, it has its run, it destroys Iran's centrifuges, but doesn't necessarily alter Iran's political will to give up its program. So it continues with the partial part of the program that Stuxnet leaves. So the United States switches footing and begins to use secondary sanctions. So every financial relationship that Iran has with a third party is targeted, and they're basically given the choice of, you can do business with Iran, or you can ultimately lose business to the United States. So to use an example, the energy sector wants to do business with Iran, and under sanctions, the US says, okay, if you have a subsidiary in the United States, they're under legal action. If you route any banking through the United States, that is also under legal action. And so it's shaping investment in Iran away from Iran, essentially. And so it's largely goes beyond economic measures because it's rooted in a diplomatic relationship. You can't get a secondary sanctions program to work without Russia on board, without China, without the EU, and ultimately without, with the UK. So the outcome is success. The United States is able to drive Iran towards the decision to accept the Iran deal. And for the United States, this achieves its main political goals of boxing in Iran's ability to get a nuke, and at the same time create a good deal of clarity into Iran's program. And so that's a success for the United States. So let's sort of switch footing to the Russian involvement in the 2016 presidential campaign. So it takes approximately 10 years for the United States to get Iran to the JCPOA. It has to use Stuxnet first, and then it has to switch to sanctions, and it has to engage in diplomacy, and it's this really decades-long campaign, and it's very complex. The Russian involvement in the 2016 presidential campaign, on the other hand, takes about 2 years, and its techniques are rather simple, based in leaking, trolling, and then an exploitation of how we in the United States consume and process social and political data. So the leaks. So the leaks are targeted towards the Democratic Party's political infrastructure. So Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and then John Podesta, the then chairman of the Clinton campaign. The leaks are put through these fronts. So DC Leaks is one of their fronts, and DC, this is taken from their About page, where they're posing as American hacktivists. They're telling you the truth about U.S. decision-making, and they're checking the validity of the information. What we now know is that this is a Russian military intelligence front, and it was used to that effect, to funnel leaked documents to the public. A little note, so this page, before it's taken down in March 2017, has about 1 million page views overall. The usage of Twitter, so they use Twitter a lot to insert themselves into U.S. political discourse, to disseminate documents and links, and a lot of these accounts are started in June 2016. So about 6 months into the year, and about a little before the election. So here's WikiLeaks. So this is the DNC email database. So these are just 44,000 leaked emails from the DNC. So a special note on how WikiLeaks made the documents public. Every leak was timed with an event. This particular leak was timed with the Democratic National Convention. So this is the convention that nominated Hillary Clinton to become the presidential nominee. So Guccifer 2.0, this is from his WordPress, still up. You can still read the documents. What's important about Guccifer 2.0 is that a lot of the documents that were leaked have no real use for a civilian. So Democratic's internal workings in those states, financial documents, analytics documents, and in a heated campaign, by making these documents public, you're essentially chipping away at any political advantage that the DNC and the DCCC might create. Again, through Twitter, June 2016 was when this account was created. Okay, so that brings us to the Podesta emails. So the Podesta emails, the leaks themselves aren't terribly interesting, it's how they were leaked. So on the day that these were leaked, at around 4 p.m., you have the Access Hollywood tape that's dropped. So the Access Hollywood tape, if you remember, is where then candidate Trump says, "Grab her by the pussy." So he's on tape saying, "Grab her by the pussy." That is dropped around 4 p.m. 20 minutes later, the Podesta emails are made public. And what happened was, now you have two major stories, and you're essentially diluting the coverage of the damaging Access Hollywood tape. You're making it more difficult for it to become the prime story, and instead you have media that is dividing itself between the Podesta emails and the Access Hollywood tape. Okay. So beyond that, the leaks outcomes, what happens is that you take the division in the Democratic Party between the Clinton camp and the Bernie camp, and you set it in stone. So now, neither part of the Democratic Party is willing to reconcile with itself, and you weaken not only Hillary Clinton's position with the Democratic Party, but you're weakening the Democratic Party overall. And you also have analytics documents, and you have financial documents that are made public, which then chip away at the Democratic Party's advantage. You also have the emergence of conspiracy theories like Pizzagate and like Seth Rich. And so what's important about these conspiracy theories, not only are they debunked, but they also create this sort of scar tissue upon political discourse. And we are still sort of contending with this, and more conspiracy theories as these go along have been evolving out of these previous theories. Okay. So the usage of trolls. So a troll here is you're creating spectacle, and in this case, creating political spectacle over hot topic social issues. So the US government largely believes this is the work of the IRA, of the Internet Research Agency, that went out, coordinated campaign of posting and running advertisements, and they targeted explicitly hot button social issues. So in this case, this is very typical of their approach. They targeted Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter activists, but again, this could just as easily be LGBTQ issues, Muslim immigration, immigration from Central America. This could be anything. They went out, took both sides for the explicit intent of aggravation and sort of creating controversy and division. So this is one of their more famous personas, Tennessee GOP. So they're posing as the GOP party of Tennessee, and the best way to describe this is that it's political shitposting. So they would go out, adopt the character of somebody on the right, but sort of on the extreme right, and go out and tweet and promote division, promote arguing, and just generally cause division on Twitter. Okay. So what we now know 2 years later is that the Russian campaign, taken as a whole from a social media perspective, does okay to good. They have, a few accounts that maybe hit 1 million page views. They have a good following, maybe 43,000 here, 50,000 here, 100,000, but it's not impressive in terms of the larger social media picture. What's, in my view, why they were successful is that it was the ability to exploit of how we produce, promote, and consume social and political data in the United States. So first, our modern ecosystem, modern media ecosystem, is driven by virality, clickbait, and fake news. So the ability to put out a story or put out an idea that it doesn't have to be true, it doesn't have to be vetted, it just has to feel true or be truthy and have that sort of sensation of being true. And it's quickly able to spread, and people just consider it to be real, to be true. Highly automated, so you can use bots to brigade, to create false consensus, to game popularity systems, to game recommendation systems, and move stories from the fringe or low popularity into the mainstream. I think from what we saw is that it's guided by the fringe. The ability of Breitbart or any media organization that sort of caters to a fringe to put out a story and then to pull other news organizations into covering or thinking about that story is a pretty significant power. So you don't need the viewers, you just need the ability to set and manipulate the agenda. Okay. So what do we consider the future of political warfare? It's an iteration or form of the Russian campaign. So their ability to attack an information system, pair it with an attack on information content, and something that is reproducible, cheap, with no specific tooling, and using somebody else's platform is the future. And then it's also the reflection of offensive and defensive information security into social spaces and political spaces. So to look at the campaign, the Russians were able to bring techniques that were already out there. So brigading, doxing, leaking documents, and botting and brigading, and they were able to put a strategy of a country behind it and use it successfully. And to the point where Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit have to catch up. They were fumbling. But at the same time, Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit have the advantage of owning their network. They own every account, every piece of data produced, they own the code, they own that whole space. And then, as we see recently, an attacker isn't obligated to nuance. The Russians aren't obligated to your First Amendment rights. They're not obligated to legal stakeholders or business stakeholders. They are only obligated to their own success. Whereas Facebook, for instance, has to engage our First Amendment rights, has to engage business holders, political stakeholders, and its decision-making is much more complex and nuanced. Lastly, and so we're 2 years away from this, and Facebook and Twitter have reconciled themselves and gone out and tried to find solutions, and we have media organizations that are devoted to outing disinformation. We have open source intelligence groups that are outing disinformation, and it's a problem taken seriously, but at the same time, it's not enough, because when we consider disinformation, we are considering something that has a very complex attack surface, and a surface that is not just technical in nature, rather it's also strategic, legal, social, and it's very difficult to just deal with on a tech basis. And at the same time, when an attacker goes after trust through a narrative, what tools do we have to rebuild trust, to challenge a narrative? We can spot a lie, we can spot, disingenuous parts of that narrative, but how do we build tools to actually attack something like that? And in my view, that's, once an attacker has chipped away your trust or your ability to trust something, it's impossible to restore or to rebuild that. On that cheery note, this is modern political warfare. I really appreciate you guys coming out. If you have any questions, comments, and concerns, I'm most responsive on Twitter. Feel free to tweet me. I will respond. And I'm also around here all week, so please, love to talk. Thank you.